All right, let's go ahead and get started with class this morning. I am without a microphone today because I forgot to bring batteries for the microphone, so that's on me. That's okay. I'm assuming you all can hear me reasonably well, and since the people in the back are nodding their heads, I'm going to go with, yeah, we'll be all right. So, we are in Esther. We started the study of Esther a few weeks ago. We finished up Esther chapter 2 last week. We're going to pick up in Esther chapter 3 this week. Just to recap real quickly, we have gone through and seen that the king of Persia, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes most likely, held a big banquet, a big feast, got himself and all of his nobles well and truly drunk from the looks of it, and decided he wanted his queen to come out and show off for them because she was very beautiful. His queen Vashti refused to do it, so he fired her and picked up a new girl. Well, actually held a beauty contest among all of the people of Persia, all of the people of the realm, including other nations, and brought in a bunch of people, one of whom was Esther, who is a Jewish girl, and she became the choice. He loved her and made her his queen, and so then he had a big banquet to celebrate. We're going through and counting all the banquets that we have as we go along here. We'll see in a minute. We'll get to some more. Esther is guided in her decision making by her cousin, or second cousin, or something like that, Mordecai, who had adopted her after the death of her parents. And so the final thing that we saw last week was that Mordecai had been involved in the discovery of a plot to kill the king. He had been the one who had revealed it through Esther to the king, and he was given credit for it, so to speak, by a sort of a writing that was made in the king's chronicles to show that he had been the one who had revealed the plot and had saved the king's life, presumably at least saved the king's life. So that's where we finished off in chapter 2. So let's pick up in chapter 3 with the introduction of our villain. So somebody read for me verses 1 through 6 of chapter 3, please.
After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, and they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus.
Okay, so we meet Haman, the son of, what is this, Hammedatha, the Agagite. We don't care about the rest of that, we just care about Haman. And Haman is promoted from the rank of presumably prince, or it's hard to tell for sure exactly what the language means here. It may refer to the idea of local rulers who were set up by the king to administer the different divisions of Persia. You didn't, in an empire as big as Persia was, you didn't just have the king or the emperor and just everybody else just commoners. You had, sort of the equivalent of, in a large corporation, you have the CEO, or you have the president, and then you have a number of vice presidents serving under them. That's probably what Haman's role was. Now, that kind of a job might be something where you normally go to wherever the region is, or it might be something where he worked and the rest of these princes were located in the palace in Persia, in Susa, and then they had people who reported to them. Either one is possible, but clearly Haman gets promoted, and once he gets promoted, as we'll see through the rest of the story, he's spending his time in Susa. So he has become kind of like the second in command. Who do we know in the Bible who kind of had a similar role to this? Joseph. Kind of a different character, a type of person, obviously, but nevertheless, Joseph was given a similar role. Now, we don't know exactly why Haman got this job. We're going to see He certainly is a cunning sort of fellow, so it may have simply been that he was being recognized for being politically savvy. It may be that he sort of used his cunning to get himself into a position of power. We don't really know for sure what the reason was. What we do know is that once he became the second in command, how did the rest of the people, the commoners, so to speak, treat him?
Well, they were ordered to pay him homage,
Okay.
to bow down to him. So they were, apparently that came from the king, and they did give, they replied, they obeyed the king and gave Haman homage.
Okay. So the king ordered that people in general should bow down to Haman, should give him homage. And so that's what they did. They were obedient to the king. Who disobeyed? Mordecai. What was Mordecai's reason for disobeying? Go for it.
Place.
Because he was Jewish, and you don't bow down to anyone but God.
Okay. So he's Jewish, and by paying homage, that term we don't come across that term a lot in modern usage. You know, when the president arrives, you don't pay homage to the president. The idea of paying homage is the idea of almost sort of like groveling. It's like you're basically elevating this other person and giving them praise that is beyond just, hey, you did a good job or something like that. So both the notion of bowing down and the notion of paying homage is something that for a Jew would be done only to God. And so to do it to a man is not acceptable. And so when Mordecai is approached by his fellow, these servants of the king who stay at the gate or who are at the gate about why he isn't bowing down and paying homage, his response is, I'm a Jew. And presumably he goes on to explain what that means to them, but the people that Esther is being written to would have understood that, so there's no reason to really explain it in that context. So, it's interesting because then the people he's talking to, what do they do with that information? The ones that he talks to at the gate.
They go rat him out.
Okay, they go rat him out to Haman. Now, it's entirely possible that Haman had actually noticed him doing this already, but at a minimum what they do is they go explain to Haman, this is why he's not bowing down to you. And it's interesting because what they say is they want to see whether his reason will stand. So what are they really testing here? What are these people, why is it that they're going to Haman about this, really?
I think they are testing Haman. Will he do something about it?
Okay.
Is he really number two?
Okay. So I think that maybe there's a degree of curiosity of whether this idea of a Jew not having to bow down is something that's valid in the first place, but I think you're right. More fundamentally, they're testing to see what Haman's going to do. How is he going to respond to this? Linda?
In my ESV study Bible, for verse 1, it says that the Agagite is a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites, the ancient enemies of Israel. Agag was defeated by King Saul and killed by the prophet Samuel, so the conflict between Haman and Mordecai mirrors the earlier contact between the ancestors.
I had forgotten about Agag and that he would have been a descendant. That's an interesting point. Thank you for bringing that up. So it doesn't look like Haman was aware of the relationship, but his behavior, as the ESV says, is mirroring the conflict between the Amalekites and the Israelites that, as you said, Saul puts it. Yeah. So, and we've seen already, we know already that the Jews were regularly subject to prejudice in a number of different areas. And being monotheistic in a world that was at the time pantheistic, being unwilling to conform to regulations that were in violation of their moral code or the law in a world that was generally accepting of those things, made them easy targets for people like this. And so the issue then is, the question that these people have is really, what is Haman going to do about this? If we tell him about it and we tell him what its reason is. And Haman, of course, doesn't like it, but it says he's filled with rage. But what does it say? He's not just interested in getting back at Mordecai himself. Who does he want to get at? All of the Jews. Okay. So what does this tell you about Haman's character?
He's a brat.
Okay.
A lot worse than that.
Yeah.
He's an egotistical.
Yeah, I was thinking he's a brat in much the same way that Adolf Hitler was a brat, I suppose.
Yeah.
Sort of. Ian.
It reminded me of King Nebuchadnezzar right now in the golden image.
Okay,
Just very, like you said, very egotistical, very full of himself, very anti-God in every kind of fiber of his being.
okay. And to take it, I want to go a step further, because the thing about Nebuchadnezzar was even Nebuchadnezzar, his only command was, if you don't bow down, you go into the fire. This is a huge step beyond this,
Right.
because this is, if you don't bow, because you won't bow down, everybody who's like you goes into the fire, And when you think about it, that's a mindset. I mean, it wasn't an accident that I picked Adolf Hitler, because he and arguably Stalin are the only people in history to have made it their business to systematically destroy an entire race of people, in both cases Jews. In Stalin's case, I guess it's not entirely fair to say that. Stalin wasn't so much interested in destroying them as he didn't like them and he just didn't care. And as a result of that, a lot of them died because they were just a problem for it. Hitler was the one who actually said, I'm going to systematically destroy this particular race. And so when we think about Haman's character, this is a guy who's not just egotistical, although that's absolutely true. His ego is married to a sense of self-importance and a willingness to do absolutely horrific things to satisfy his ego, and for no other reason than that.
I've always wondered if there weren't other Jews that were following Mordecai's example, and that may have made Haman even more
Could be.
angry. It doesn't tell us in the scripture that it appears he's the only one, but that wouldn't have been the case. There had to have been more
Well,
Jews
it depends.
there.
He might have been the only one that Haman regularly encountered. And particularly since Mordecai was at the gate every day, there's a good bet that Haman was pretty regularly, maybe every day or multiple times every day, was encountering this guy who wouldn't bow down. Whereas perhaps the majority of Jews, he would have encountered them infrequently or whatever. But Mordecai becomes the focus of his obsession, but then he extends it to his entire race, which, like I said, you may be right. There may be other incidents where he finds out, and so it's the Jews, kind of the same way Hitler, with everything that happened that was bad, Hitler began to blame it on the Jews. Both publicly and in his own mind he did as well. And so we have this narcissism coupled with this a lack of restraint, and when you put those two things together with someone who has massive amounts of power, you get abuses. We've seen that throughout history, not just with Hitler, we see that with lots of people throughout history. In this particular case, though, the problem is that Haman's rage and narcissism are focused on the Jews, and he wants to destroy all of them in the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now, this is a very big deal, because this would have essentially meant the destruction of the entire Jewish race, or pretty close to it. Because Persia had absorbed Assyria. In fact, Babylon had absorbed Assyria. Persia had absorbed Babylon. And so the overwhelming majority of the Jews that existed in the world existed within the borders of the Persian Empire, including the ones in Jerusalem and Judea, because that was part of the Persian Empire at the time. Now, the Persians let them kind of largely rule themselves as long as they paid taxes and didn't cause problems, but they were part of the Persian Empire. So this hatred that Haman has developed, and this determination to wipe out everybody in the whole kingdom, is going to hit pretty much all the Jews, with the exception of a relatively small group that by this time is already living in Greece. But the vast majority of them are going to be destroyed if Haman is able to go forward with this. Okay, somebody read for me verses 7. Well, actually, any more comments or thoughts before we move to the next paragraph? Yes, Betty.
Were any of the Jews back in Jerusalem yet?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought.
And there was a substantial minority of them who had moved back there by this time. Now, again, like you said, Jerusalem and Judea would have been under the control of Ahasuerus, under the Persian kingdom. So the edict that we're going to talk about in a minute here would have covered them, as well as the ones who were in what we would think of as the capital of Persia or something like that. So, okay, somebody read for me verses 7 through 11. I believe that's the end of the second chapter, or the second paragraph.
In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month, until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all your province of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples. They do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasury. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you.
Okay, so it's a little confusing, or can be, when you read this at first. It was for me when I kind of read this. In fact, I've read this story, studied this story before. I never really paid a lot of attention to what is going on here at the beginning of this paragraph, verses 7 and 8, what it's talking about. So what does Haman do at the beginning of this paragraph? What is he trying to do?
It seems to me it's out of order, but what I think he's doing is he's picking a day to put in the decree that says this is the day we want to kill all the Jews.
Okay. How does he do that? You're absolutely right. How does he do that?
It says pur, but it's obviously some kind of a drawing that he had.
Okay. It says cast a lot.
Pardon?
So it says he cast the lot. And the term for that lot is the pur, or P-U-R, pure. We don't know exactly how it's pronounced. But so the lot has a name. In other words, it's probably some kind of a formal process. The Israelites had something like that. When the priests were supposed to try to figure out God's will, there was a way they would cast lots, and I think that it was given a name as well. I can't remember for sure, but so it's a formal process by which he's trying to figure out, as you said, what the right day is for this decree to actually go forward. What does this tell us about Haman's character?
Well, I think he recognized, or he believed that he could convince the king to do it.
Okay, that's absolutely true, but I'm talking about the lot itself. Why is he? What is the fact that he's casting lots to figure out the right day to do this tell us about his character, or at least suggest about his character?
Then he can blame somebody else.
Okay, maybe that.
Well, it says that Nisan, the Jews are actually remembering and celebrating their deliverance from Egypt.
That's true.
So here you have them doing this, and the euphoria of doing that, and Haman is planning their destruction.
Okay, so there is an interesting coincidence of timing. The Jewish year starts, it was established in Exodus, as starting with the celebration of Passover. It's not the very first day of the month, it's partway into the month, but the month begins with Passover as the primary celebration. So Nisan is the month that begins that. It's interesting that Haman is casting lots at the same time, but in doing this, in choosing to cast lots to figure out when is best to do this, it does give us some indication about his personality, because it suggests that he is somewhat superstitious, or at least feels like in order to make sure he's going to be successful, he needs the intervention or the approval of an outside agency, the gods or fate or whatever you want to call it, depending on what he may have specifically believed. This is kind of interesting because generally speaking, people who think in those terms are ones who are not entirely confident in what they're doing in terms of their choices and their decisions. People who are comfortable with making decisions for themselves don't feel the need, as Jerry says, to blame it on somebody else. They don't feel the need to find a way to establish some sort of divine authority for a decision that they're going to make. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use the scriptures in making our decisions. What I'm saying is that when it comes to a specific decision, or when it comes to a choice that we're making, we should be honest enough to say this is the decision that I'm making, not this is something God has made me do or something like that. And by the same token, if we're using and we're following the principles of the scriptures in general, we don't necessarily have to go into the scriptures and try to hammer out a reason for why we want to move from Payson to, Denver or something like that. We don't need to do that. But Haman doesn't feel comfortable taking full responsibility for this decision and making the decision entirely himself. Instead, he wants to basically make sure that the gods or the fates or whatever you want to call it are going to line up and maximize his success here. Maybe in part to make sure that the king will give him approval, maybe in part to make sure that the whole thing the scheme will go off properly.
I was gonna say, that way it does give him some cover, because he can say, this is just not my idea. Look, we cast lots, and
Right.
guess what? It comes up that, yeah, these people are gonna get destroyed, you know?
Right.
It's not just me, look who else, you know? So he's so evil that he doesn't want to take all that responsibility, even though that's it's him.
Right.
But he has a little bit of cover and say, look, it wasn't just me, you know,
Right.
everybody else, the gods or whatever they say to do it, you know.
And it's interesting because I think you're absolutely right, and yet built into that is an inherently flawed way of looking at it. Because if the question you ask is, should we do this, then maybe you get one answer. But if the question you ask is, when should we do this, then you're not looking for an answer to should we or should we not. You're simply looking for when do I do it. And you're obviously going to get an answer you like, even if it means putting it out most of the year, the way it turns out in this particular situation that it does. So he has this process that he follows, and there's a degree to which I think there is an element of a desire to have a deniability for it. And as we're going to see, as we see here, there's an effort to make it really, other people are the ones that are actually going to do it. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. I don't want to get to that right now. So he casts a lot. It's interesting because, like we said, P-U-R, Pur is the name of the lot. This will later lead to the name of the celebration associated with this deliverance as being known as what? Anybody know what the festival that the Jews celebrate for the deliverance that came through Esther was? Purim, yes, Purim. So they celebrate this as Purim, and it comes from that name. The casting of the lot is associated with it, which is kind of I wonder sometimes if there wasn't a certain amount of maybe a significant amount of irony that was given into choosing this name, because here's this random process, an ungodly process that's used to determine when this should happen, and the Jews take that up as the name that's being associated with the deliverance that's very intentional that comes from God. But in any event, the name of the festival is pulled from that term. Yes.
In the King James, it almost reads like there were more than one opportunity, or more than one lot cast.
Well, what I'm thinking happened is that they kind of were casting it to see which month should we do it, so they just kept casting it. There are two possibilities. The way I first read it in my Bible was that they were casting it month by month. At the beginning of each month, they would cast a lot and say, is it this month? No, it's not this month. Is it this month? No, it's not this month.
It might be.
But I think, based on the way yours reads, and I think more generally, it makes more sense that he probably cast a series of lots to figure out which month to do it on. Because, as we'll see, the date that's actually established is the 13th day of the 12th month. So if he waited until the beginning of the 12th month to cast that lot, and given the size of the Persian Empire, there's no way they would have been able to give notice throughout the empire. So it's much more likely that he did all of it during the first month, but cast a series of lots. If you remember, we don't have a lot of good examples of exactly how casting lots was done in the ancient times. But we do know, for example, or we do see the example after Jericho, when, what's the name of the guy who takes some of the plunder from Jericho? I forget his name, doesn't matter. Anyway. No, he was the city they attacked next. It didn't go so good because of what the guy had done. So he had taken some, I think it does start with an A, but anyway, he had taken some of the plunder from Jericho, hidden it in his tent with the knowledge, presumably, of his wife and his children. It caused the Israelites to lose the next battle, which Joshua realized was clearly not something that was just because God had given up on them. In fact, God told him somebody took some stuff. So instead of, I guess, I don't know exactly why they chose to do it this way, but instead of simply saying to God, well, who was it? They cast lots, and they would have followed the procedure that the priests used to cast lots and divine things according to what the law had said to do. But essentially what that allowed them to do was to narrow it down to tribe, and then from tribe to clan, and then from clan to family, and then from family to individual, and get their way down to that. And I've often wondered maybe the reason they didn't do that is because they were sort of testing to see whether he would just admit what he'd done at some point rather than make this whole process play out. Or alternatively, that it was a way of sort of demonstrating for the Israelites very viscerally that God would in fact reveal the truth if he, if the priests followed this process. But either way, they used this to narrow it down so there are multiple castings of the lot. And so however they did this, it appears that they were, whether it's, what month do we do it in and they cast a lot, and then what day do we do it on, or whether it was, casting a lot for each month and figuring it out. But eventually they come up with the 12th month to do it, and we're going to see the 13th day is the day that's actually chosen. So, what is Haman, now Haman has to convince the king about this, but he's got kind of an advantage, which is the king already obviously trusts him very greatly, or he wouldn't have given him the position he did. It'd be kind of like Joseph going into the Pharaoh and saying, hey, we need to build a few more storehouses. The Pharaoh's going to be like, sure, take care of it, it's your job, And when Haman comes in and tells this to the king, it's clear that the king has a great deal of trust in him. So what is his argument that he makes to the king? Why does he say that we should get rid of the Jews? He doesn't tell him who they are, he just says it's people. Why should we get rid of them? Linda?
Well, I think he's trying to convince the king that the Jews don't keep his laws. They're rebellious.
Okay, so they don't observe the king's laws. Their laws are different from those of all other people. Okay, and it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. So he's basically saying, this is really all about you. I'm here to help you out and to take care of this budding problem that you have and get rid of this group of people that's a problem for you. Now, there are several things about this that are fairly clever. One of them is, if we remember back to chapter 1, one of the arguments that was made about why it was necessary to remove Vashti as queen was the fear that the modeling of her behavior would lead to other women behaving the same way towards their husbands. And so that was the persuasive argument, that in fact, that was made to the king that led to him deciding that this is what we need to do, is we need to fire her, basically. So Haman's argument is, if you think about it, is really just a variation of that on a larger scale, which is these people as a whole people do not follow your laws. They are not obedient. And there's this implication underneath this, what might they do if they, start really trying to rebel? What kind of a problem might they cause? And so it appears, or it seems like that Haman may have very well shaped his message to what he already knew the king was receptive to. The idea of the Jews being, or of the potential for what Jesus would later call yeast getting into the leaven, or leaven getting into the bread. You get a little bit in there and there's no way to get it out again. And so that seems to be kind of part of what he's focusing on here. Now he says their laws are different from those of all other people. Specifically what he's talking about there almost certainly is the fact that they have laws about who they will bow down to and what they will worship, whereas the rest of the Persians presumably do not. Now, why do you think he's presenting this in such a kind of manufactured way? Why is he approaching it from the standpoint of here's the problem, and it's really your problem that I'm here to solve? Why doesn't he just come to the king and say, hey, there's this dude who won't bow down to me, and in fact none of his people will bow down to me. You made me second in command and ordered everybody to bow down to me. I want to get rid of him. Why didn't he just say that?
Because Mordecai saved his life already.
Okay, so there's that, and so he doesn't probably want to point out that because presumably Haman is aware of the fact that Mordecai did that, because the plot would have been a big deal. It was written in the Chronicles of the King and all that sort of thing. So one of the problems is if you tell the king that Mordecai is the guy, the king might say, you know what, we're going to grant him an exception.
Yeah.
So that's an issue, and that's a significant issue. What else though? What else may be going on here, Ian?
I think it's kind of like buttering the king up, making it his idea.
Okay, so I'm doing this for you, and the king eventually starts to think, yeah, this is a good idea. This is what I want to do. So there's an element of that, and so he doesn't want to make it about himself. Anything else though? This is one I don't really expect you guys to have the answer to this one, because this isn't necessarily something you would know without knowing some history and some of the Persian rules. The Persians had done Babylon won better, or eventually they had. Darius in particular, after encountering Daniel and tossing him to the lion's den because he wouldn't bow down to Darius's God and worship, or because he actually bowed down to Jehovah and worshipped. Darius called him out of the lion's den and said, now I know that your God is real, and now I'm not going to make you follow my rules about who I bow down, or who you're supposed to bow down to. That edict, depending on how broad it was, would have actually given the Jews an exemption from having to bow down to Haman or to anybody else. So there's a very real possibility here that the reason Haman has to present it this way is because he knows that the Jews are otherwise exempt from the rule. Now that's not a certainty, but that is a significant possibility, or significant likelihood here. That, or at a minimum, that Haman knows from history that it's a bad idea to try to make the Jews bow down because of what happened with Daniel and what's happened with other people in the past. So Haman doesn't want to present it to the king in a way that might alert the king to the fact that what they're doing here is really just about bowing down to him, and to that one thing. He wants to make it sound like it's a much bigger threat. And you can understand if you're the king and you don't have any other information and you're told that there's this threat, these people who don't follow your laws, and it's left broad like that, you couldn't afford to make a blanket exception just because they had different views. You know, if their view was, we need to have our own king and have our own kingdom, and you have to let us, as the king of the larger empire, you would be saying, no, that's not okay. I don't care what you believe. We're not going to do that. But in the case of simply who you worship and who you bow down to, Persia was very liberal about that with most of its subjects, trying to minimize the conflict that would come. And like I said, in the case of the Jews, there may have been a specific exemption based on what had happened with Daniel. So he has to be careful here, Haman does, because of the risk that if he alerts the king to the specific situation, that the king may view that as an exceptional situation, especially when you add to it, as Mark said, Mordecai is the guy who saved the king's life. So it's, you know, there's an added incentive at that point for the king to say, yeah, I don't think we're going to do that. You know, we're not going to wipe out a whole bunch of people just because one guy who saved my life won't bow down to you just like his ancestor would. You know, that's not going to work for him. So Haman is trying to be careful to dance around the issue to make sure that the king will get on board with this. And what else does he do to kind of sweeten the deal? What else does he offer?
Gives a reward.
Okay, not just a reward, it's actually, he's going to pay for it. He's going to pay for the cost of those who will do the work. I guess actually a reward is probably as good a word as a bounty, something like that almost, basically, that he offers to give them. So, so what he wants from the king is what? What does he want the king to do? Issue a decree. So only the king can issue a decree. At least that's what we see throughout Esther anyway. Haman has an idea, he basically sets it in front of the king, but at the end of the day, the king is the one who issues the decrees and seals them with his signet ring. Actually, he gives the signet ring to Haman and says, do what you want to. The silver is yours since you're paying for it, and the people, you can do whatever you want to the people. So he gives him his approval to go forward with this thing. Okay. Now, Haman wants to do this through other people. It's not clear whether Haman would probably want to go and kill Mordecai. Personally, I'm guessing he probably would, given his personality. But it's interesting because of the parallels, again, that we see between this and what went on with Hitler and Nazi Germany. Hitler ordered that this be done, and then the order went through several layers of people, one of whom Eichmann was responsible for primarily coming up with the actual process and putting the processes into place. And then below him, a series of different commanders and leaders who set up the concentration camps, operated the concentration camps, and then all the way down to guards who would carry out the process of execution and burial or cremation, depending on the camp. And all of this was done in a very mechanistic fashion, and it was very far removed from Hitler directly, although the orders had come from him. And it was, for the most part, it was fairly removed from Eichmann as well, even though the specific orders had come from him. Now, after the war ended, after a number of the people who were involved with the concentration camps were arrested, what was the defense that pretty much every one of them gave?
It was following orders.
Following orders. In some cases, at the highest levels, Eichmann, for example, couldn't make that argument. want to say, I'm not sure it was Eichmann. Anyway, several of the people who were at the highest levels who were involved with it couldn't legitimately make that argument because they were the ones giving orders. And the fact that Hitler had given them the orders was not considered a significant shield. The orders that the argument that they all made was, it wasn't my fault. I didn't really even know this was going on. I didn't give any orders. That was basically what most of them were saying. And the Nazis had done their very best to get rid of all the documentation to prove who had ordered what and everything like that. It wasn't completely destroyed, but it was largely eliminated. And so it was difficult, or there was the feeling that some of them might get away with this. As it turned out, none of them successfully were able to make either of those arguments. But there's a degree to which what Haman is doing here is the same kind of thing. He's trying to distance himself from this. And to take it a step further, and to recognize that just because Haman is the ultimate villain of this story, that there are some other people who are helping him along with this, think about what this says about King Ahasuerus and his personality. Somebody has come to you and said, I want to wipe out an entire group of people, an entire race of people from within your nation, because they don't follow your rules. And the king just says, sure, go ahead and do it. What does that suggest about his personality?
He was deferring to other people for
Okay.
authority. He wasn't taking it himself.
He wasn't taking responsibility for himself. So you wonder sometimes when you look at the story of Esther and you look at the king and what the king actually does, where he deliberately does things. He either is reacting to something that's happened, like Vashti refusing to go before him, or as we'll see later in the story when Esther tells him what's really going on, he reacts very, very harshly and or he reacts very grandiosely in a big manner. He gets furious. Or he is partying. That's pretty much it. He lets other people take the lead on stuff, and he seems to enjoy being the center of attention and throwing parties and being wealthy and powerful more than he does the minutiae of actually governing, of actually knowing what's going on. Because you can bet that good leaders, you have to take it and recognize in the context, good leaders in a context of the ancient time when killing off an entire race of people didn't necessarily get you too worried. But good leaders, when somebody comes and says, there is a group of people that is dangerous, that is, they're not following your laws, good leaders are going to say, I need to look into this some more. I need some more information about this. And it probably is going to look for information from somebody besides just that single source, or at least is going to ask them for their information. Where did you get your information? Where does this come from? Good leaders don't make decisions like this or simply hand over the power to do something like this to someone without having a little bit more to go on, And so you look throughout the scriptures at leaders, Gentile leaders, non-Jewish leaders, who would be characterized as good leaders. And one of the things that we consistently see is that their decisions, and when they support decisions being made, they do it because they have seen evidence of that it's a good decision. The Pharaoh with Joseph has seen that Joseph can translate and interpret dreams, that Joseph is wise, that he has good ideas, and based on the information he provides, the Pharaoh says, go ahead, and he puts him in charge. We could see in Abraham's period of time, he encounters the Philistine king Abimelech, and Abimelech takes Sarah to be his wife because Abraham has lied about his relationship with her. But Abimelech is contacted by God and said, basically, you're a dead man because you took this man's wife. And he said, I haven't touched her. And God said, that's because you're a good man, and I made sure you didn't touch her, so that you could be, there was a way out of this. But these are people who make wise decisions. Ahasuerus, it seems like, doesn't necessarily make wise decisions. Now, to his credit, he surrounds himself with wise people. That's what we saw in the first chapter. He was in the habit of gathering together wise people and asking for their opinion in public so other people could hear how he was making his decisions. But it kind of sounds like when he's left to his own devices to make decisions, he doesn't always do such a good job. And this is probably one of those situations where he should have called his wise counselors together and said, hey, Haman's got this idea, what do you guys think? But instead, he just says, no, go ahead and do it, sounds good to me. Because I think Haman has buttered him up, he's made it about him, and he's just more interested in having his feasts and parties and stuff than he is in actually figuring out what's really going on here. So, All right, we're going to stop here. We will pick up with the actual giving of the decree, and then we'll talk about starting going into chapter 4, what happens next. So the worksheet that we're working on kind of skips over most of chapter 3. It really doesn't pick back up with its questions until chapter 4. So I would, as you're kind of preparing for tomorrow, I keep doing that. For some reason, Sunday is the only day of the week in my brain. So, what's that?
This is not school.
It's not school. There's that too. Yeah, maybe that's part of the reason. I didn't used to do this until I was teaching. So you're probably right. Anyway, for next Sunday, you may want to take a look, not just at the end of chapter 3, but maybe read through chapter 4 and take a look at some of those questions, the next up through about question 10 or so, to get a feel for kind of, some of the things we're going to talk about next week. So, any final comments before we shut it down? All right then, we'll take a break. In 15 minutes, we'll come back for worship. Thank you guys.